One day, during the cold winter days, Steve was sitting in the king's palace. The king said to Steve playfully,
"Steve, can you sit outside the palace in the open air and on a cold winter night while you are bare-chested?"
With utmost courage and determination, Steve responded, "I can indeed do that, and I will take on your challenge even further. You may choose the night you want me to spend outside, bare-chested in the open air." The king was astonished and said to Steve,
"If you accomplish this, Steve, there will be a great reward for you. I will give you a large bag filled with golden coins as a reward."
On a bitterly cold winter night, the king chose a night with extreme coldness for the challenge. He commanded his guards to accompany Steve to the mountain summit, strip him of his clothes, and stay close to him throughout the night, making sure he wouldn't light a fire for warmth. Indeed, the guards donned their heavy winter clothing, protecting themselves from the biting cold, and ascended the mountain with Steve. They stripped him of his clothes and positioned themselves a little distance away, watching him closely as the king had commanded. Steve endured the night, staying awake due to the intense cold, to the point where his blood almost felt like it was freezing in his veins. On the following day, the guards escorted Steve down from the mountain summit and brought him back to the king's palace. To the king's astonishment, Steve was completely unharmed, and nothing adverse had befallen him. Steve went on to recount his nights spent atop the mountain, describing the horrors he endured alone in the freezing cold. His tale left the king in awe of his bravery and resilience. Then the king asked him,
"Did you see any lit fire anywhere while you were on top of the mountain?"
Steve replied, "Yes, I did see a faint light from a flickering lamp far away, coming from the window of one of the houses in the village on the mountainside." Upon hearing this, the king replied,
"So, you warmed yourself with the light of that lamp and forfeited my reward to you."
Anger surged within Steve, and he fell silent. Then, he began to contemplate a plan to regain the reward promised to him by this deceitful king. After several weeks had passed, Steve went to the king's palace and invited him and his retinue to have lunch with him. He told them that he would prepare a sumptuous feast amidst the meadows, surrounded by flowers and trees. The king and his retinue gladly accepted Steve's invitation. They arrived at Steve's house, and he had already set up a special spot for them among the lush trees. He began to regale them with stories and humorous anecdotes, entertaining them until it was time for lunch. The king started feeling hungry. Steve would occasionally leave the guests for a short while and then return. As the king's hunger intensified, he finally asked Steve,
"Steve, where is the food? We are very hungry."
Steve replied, "The food is not ready yet. It's still being cooked." Steve asserted that it wasn't his fault but the fire's fault for not being ready. The king then rose from his seat and said to his retinue,
"Let's go and see what Steve has prepared for us."
They all went to witness what Steve had cooked for them. To their surprise, they found that Steve had placed several pots of food hanging from the top of a tree. He had lit a fire on the ground, but the fire didn't reach the pots. Instead, the smoke rose and surrounded the pots, giving the impression that the food was being cooked. Steve had cleverly used the smoke to create the illusion of cooking, but in reality, the food remained raw. At this point, the king became furious and said,
Steve, what is this? Are you mocking us?
Steve responded, In that night I spent on top of the mountain, I saw a faint light from a lamp far away, coming from one of the village houses. I interpreted it as a sign of warmth, and that's why I used it to warm myself. As for the food, it was merely a few meters away from the fire, and I thought it would cook due to the proximity. Steve cleverly defended himself, citing the light he saw on the mountain as the reason for using it for warmth, and expecting the food to cook due to its proximity to the fire. His explanation left the king speechless, realizing the ingenuity of Steve's actions. Here, the king laughed at Steve's cleverness and his anger subsided. He then ordered to give him the promised reward, the large bag of golden coins. Once upon a time, Jack was strolling through the market, buying some things. Suddenly, a man came up from behind and slapped him on the cheek. Jack turned to him and wanted to retaliate with a hit, but the man apologized profusely, saying, I'm sorry, sir. I thought you were someone I know, and we have some old grudges between us. However, Jack didn't accept this excuse and insisted on holding him accountable. As the shouting escalated and their argument grew more heated, the people around them suggested they go to a local elder to settle their dispute. Jack and his rival went to the authority, and it happened that the authority was related to the man who had hit Jack. When the authority heard the story, he winked at his relative, meaning, Don't worry, I'll get you out of this mess. Then the authority issued his judgment that the man should pay Jack a $50 fine for hitting him. The man protested, But sir, I don't have any money with me right now. The judge said while winking at him, Go and fetch it immediately, and Steve will wait for you at my place until you bring it. So the man left, and Steve sat in the judge's chamber waiting for his rival to bring the money. However, as time passed and hours went by without the man returning with the money, Jack understood the trickery and realized through the authorities' winks to his rival that they knew each other. So, what did Jack do? He stood up and slapped the authority on his cheek, a slap that made his turban fly off, and said to him, When my rival brings the $50, it's all yours.
When you resort to being offensive or hurtful, you may face negative or hostile responses, and it's important not to dismiss that possibility. It's always better to avoid causing harm to protect yourself from negative reactions. You might fail to understand the motives of others and perceive their responses as unpleasant, but it could be their attempt to maintain personal boundaries. From a logical standpoint, if you seek a positive response, you should start by treating others with courtesy and respect. Negative responses may reflect the negative emotions you trigger in others, so it's better to practice understanding and patience. Logical thinking guides you to take responsibility for your actions and strive to be a positive role model in your interactions with others. It offers an opportunity to build positive relationships and improve communication instead of exacerbating the problem. Beautiful responses can be a direct result of the beautiful actions and love you show to others. It's logical to prefer apologizing when you make a mistake instead of deliberately being offensive. And you, my dear friends, what have you deduced from this story?